There's a number that most people cannot process when they first encounter it. At its absolute peak, one single empire controlled 25% of the entire world's gross domestic product. Not 10%, not 15%, 25%. 1/4 of every coin, every trade, every harvest, every luxury good, every piece of gold and silver and silk and spice produced anywhere on the face of the earth, flowing through the hands of a single civilization. To put that in perspective, the United States of America, the most economically powerful nation in the history of the modern world, currently controls approximately 24% of global GDP. The Mughal Empire was richer. And here is what should stop you completely. This empire was not built by a powerful dynasty with centuries of accumulated wealth and military dominance behind it. It was built by a homeless prince, a man who had lost everything, a man who had been driven from his own kingdom, who had wandered Central Asia for years with a shrinking army and no territory to call his own, who had failed so many times that any reasonable person would have told him to stop. He did not stop. How does a refugee prince with 12,000 soldiers walk into the most contested subcontinent on Earth and build the wealthiest empire in human history? How does that empire produce the Taj Mahal, invent Urdu poetry, and feed 100 million people, and then collapse into dust in less than a century? The answer is not what you expect. This is the story of the Mughal Empire, and it begins with almost nothing. To understand what the Mughals became, you first have to understand the man who started everything. And the man who started everything was, by any objective measure, a failure. Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur was born in 1483 in the Fergana Valley, a small, landlocked, strategically insignificant corner of Central Asia that is today part of Uzbekistan. He inherited his father's tiny kingdom at the age of 11, and then spent the next 2 decades watching everything fall apart around him. He tried to take Samarkand, the legendary city of Timur, his ancestor, the city he believed was his birthright. He took it, lost it, took it again, lost it again. His own kingdom in Fergana slipped away while he was distracted. He found himself at one point a prince with no kingdom, no treasury, no permanent army, and no obvious future. Wandering the mountains of Central Asia with a few hundred loyal followers who stayed not because they had better options, but because they believed in something about this particular man that they could not quite articulate. Meanwhile, to the south, India was fracturing. The Delhi Sultanate, which had dominated northern India for 3 centuries, was collapsing under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Ibrahim Lodi, its last sultan, was a ruler so comprehensively despised by his own nobles that several of them secretly wrote to Babur and invited him to invade. They told him India was there for the taking. Babur looked south and made a decision that would change the history of the entire subcontinent forever. On the morning of April 21st, 1526, 2 armies faced each other on a flat plain outside a small town called Panipat, about 90 kilometers north of Delhi. On one side, Ibrahim Lodi, the Sultan of Delhi. 100,000 soldiers, 1,000 war elephants, the established power of northern India, defending territory his dynasty had controlled for generations. On the other side, Babur, 12,000 men, no elephants, no territorial base, no retreat option. If he lost here, there was nowhere to go back to. He had one thing Lodi did not: gunpowder artillery. Babur had studied Ottoman military tactics and brought field cannons to a subcontinent that had never encountered them in organized battlefield deployment before. When his artillery opened fire, Lodi's war elephants, the most feared military asset in Indian warfare, panicked. They turned and stampeded back through their own infantry. Lodi's formations collapsed, and Babur's cavalry, executing a pincer movement of textbook precision, destroyed what remained. The Battle of Panipat lasted a single day. The Delhi Sultanate ended, and the Mughal Empire began. But here is what makes Babur genuinely extraordinary. He was not just a military genius, he was a poet, a gardener, a man who wrote one of the most remarkable autobiographies in the entire history of world literature, the Baburnama, in which he described battles, landscapes, friendships, grief, and the taste of melons from his homeland with equal literary care. He wept openly when he missed Central Asia. He planted formal gardens everywhere he conquered because gardens reminded him of home. He died in 1530, 4 years after Panipat, leaving behind an empire that his son Humayun promptly lost. Humayun spent 15 years in exile, driven out by an Afghan chieftain named Sher Shah Suri, who was, by most accounts, a significantly better administrator than Humayun ever was. He wandered Persia. He begged for help. He rebuilt slowly. And finally, in 1555, he retook Delhi. 1 year later, he fell down a flight of stairs and died. And the empire passed to his 13-year-old son, a boy named Akbar, who was about to make everyone forget that his father and grandfather had ever struggled at all. There are rulers who inherit empires, and there are rulers who deserve them. Akbar was 13 years old when the most powerful throne in Asia landed in his hands. 13. An age at which most boys in the 16th century were still learning to ride properly, still being corrected by their tutors, still figuring out who they were going to be. And yet something in Akbar, something that no historian has ever fully explained and no biography has ever completely captured, was already formed, already decided, already pointed in a direction that would reshape the entire subcontinent. He could not read, not a single word. Akbar was illiterate his entire life, and he became the greatest administrator, the most sophisticated political thinker, and the most genuinely visionary ruler the Mughal Empire ever produced. He expanded the empire in every direction with a military precision that his grandfather Babur would have recognized and admired. He took Rajputana, Gujarat, Bengal, Kashmir, Sindh. By the time he was done, the Mughal Empire covered most of the Indian subcontinent. But conquest was never Akbar's real genius. His real genius was what he did after the conquest. He married his enemies. Not metaphorically, literally. Akbar married Rajput Hindu princesses, the daughters of the very kings he had just defeated, and incorporated their fathers and brothers into his imperial administration as trusted generals and governors. He abolished the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims that had been a feature of Islamic governance in India for centuries. He invited Hindu, Jain, Zoroastrian, and Christian scholars to his court for theological debates that lasted through the night. He created a new spiritual movement called Din-e-Ilahi that attempted to synthesize the best elements of every religion he had encountered. Was it naive? Perhaps. Did it work perfectly? No, but the idea behind it, that an empire as diverse as India could only be held together by genuine inclusion rather than forced conformity, was so far ahead of its time that the subcontinent is still arguing about it today. Under Akbar, the Mughal Empire controlled 25% of world GDP, more wealth than any other single political entity on Earth. Cities like Agra and Fatehpur Sikri were larger, richer, and more cosmopolitan than anything in contemporary Europe. The imperial court was a center of art, music, poetry, and philosophy that attracted talent from Persia, Central Asia, and every corner of the subcontinent. His son Jahangir inherited this magnificent machine and spent his reign making it more beautiful. A passionate collector, a precise observer of the natural world, a man whose court painters produced miniatures of such extraordinary delicacy that European artists who encountered them could not believe what they were looking at. Jahangir also had the extraordinary good fortune to fall completely, helplessly in love with a woman named Meher-un-Nisa, whom he renamed Nur Jahan, Light of the World. She was the most powerful woman in Mughal history. She issued imperial orders in her own name. She designed her father's tomb. She conducted diplomatic negotiations. She effectively ran the empire while Jahangir pursued his artistic obsessions. And she did it with a competence so total that almost no one complained. And then came Shah Jahan, who looked at everything his predecessors had built, the military power, the administrative sophistication, the artistic achievement, the sheer accumulated wealth of a century of Mughal rule, and decided that what the empire really needed was a monument. His wife, Mumtaz Mahal, died in 1631, giving birth to their 14th child. Shah Jahan was so devastated by her death that witnesses described him as physically transformed overnight. His hair turned white. He stopped eating. He withdrew from public life for weeks. And when he emerged, he had made a decision. He was going to build her something that the world would never forget. 22 years, 20,000 workers, craftsmen brought from Persia, Ottoman Turkey, and Central Asia. Marble inlaid with precious stones in patterns of such mathematical perfection that architects today still cannot fully explain how they were achieved without modern instruments. A reflecting pool that mirrors the entire structure in still water at dawn, creating an image so perfect it looks less like a reflection and more like a portal to another world. The Taj Mahal. A man built the most beautiful structure on earth because he missed his wife. And somehow, impossibly, against every expectation of what political power and imperial ambition are supposed to produce, it worked. It is still working. 400 years later, people who know nothing about Mughal history, nothing about Shah Jahan, nothing about Mumtaz Mahal, stand in front of that white marble dome at sunrise and feel something move inside them that they cannot name. That is the Mughal Empire at its peak. Not the GDP figures, not the military campaigns, not the administrative sophistication. 5. But the fact that, at the absolute height of its power, the richest empire in human history used that power to build something beautiful for someone it loved. Every great empire has a moment, a single, identifiable turning point, where you can look back and say, there, that is where it started. That is the exact place where the trajectory changed, where the thing that had been rising began, almost imperceptibly at first, to fall. For the Mughal Empire, that moment has a name: Aurangzeb. Shah Jahan had 4 sons, and in 1658, while their father lay ill in Agra, those 4 sons did what Mughal princes had always done when power was uncertain. They went to war with each other. Aurangzeb, the 3rd son, the most militarily capable, the most coldly strategic, the most religiously devout, won. He defeated his brothers one by one. He had his most dangerous rival brother publicly executed. And then he did something that shocked even the brutal standards of Mughal succession politics. He imprisoned his own father. Shah Jahan, the man who had built the Taj Mahal, who had ruled the richest empire on earth, who had expanded Mughal power to its greatest territorial extent, spent the last 8 years of his life under house arrest in Agra Fort. Looking out from his window across the Yamuna River at the white marble dome of the monument he had built for his wife, unable to leave, unable to rule, just looking. Aurangzeb was not a stupid man. He was not even, by the standards of his time, a cruel one. He was disciplined, personally austere, militarily relentless, and genuinely devout in his Islamic faith. But he made one catastrophic error that a man of his intelligence should have been able to avoid. He undid Akbar. He reimposed the jizya tax on non-Muslims. He issued orders for the destruction of Hindu temples. He reversed the policy of religious inclusion that had been the invisible architecture holding an enormously diverse empire together for a century. He replaced Akbar's radical, difficult, genuinely visionary idea that India could only be governed through inclusion with a narrower vision that felt more righteous and proved far more fragile. The Marathas rose against him. Shivaji, their leader, conducted a guerrilla campaign against Mughal authority so effective and so persistent that Aurangzeb spent the last 26 years of his life in the Deccan trying to crush it. He never did. He died there in 1707, at the age of 88, having spent nearly 3 decades at war and having made the Mughal Empire simultaneously larger and more unstable than it had ever been. And somewhere on the coast of India, barely noticed, almost irrelevant, a trading company was quietly watching, taking notes, waiting. There is a particular kind of humiliation that belongs exclusively to great empires in their final years. It is not the humiliation of being defeated by a superior civilization. It is not the humiliation of being outthought or outbuilt or outgoverned by someone genuinely better. It is the humiliation of being dismantled, piece by careful piece, by people who should never have been able to touch you. People who arrived on your shores asking for permission to trade, who built warehouses on your coastline, who smiled and bowed and paid their taxes to your governors, and who, while you were distracted by your own internal fractures, quietly built an army, bought your generals, corrupted your nobles, and walked away with everything. That is what the British East India Company did to the Mughal Empire. And it is one of the most extraordinary acts of institutional theft in the entire history of human civilization. The East India Company was not a government. It was a trading corporation. It had shareholders. It paid dividends. It had a logo. And between roughly 1600 and 1757, it operated in India as exactly what it claimed to be, a commercial enterprise interested in pepper, cotton, silk, and indigo. It built trading posts. It negotiated with local rulers. It was, by the standards of the Mughal court, a minor irritant. A group of foreign merchants who needed to be managed and taxed and occasionally reminded of their place. And then came Plassey. On June 23, 1757, a company military force of approximately 3,000 soldiers faced the army of Siraj-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Bengal, on a mango grove battlefield near the town of Plassey. The Nawab commanded 50,000 men, 50,000 against 3,000. By any military calculation, the outcome should not have been in doubt. But Robert Clive, the company's military commander, had done something before the battle that made the numbers irrelevant. He had bribed Mir Jafar, the Nawab's most senior military commander, to betray his master on the battlefield. When the fighting began, Mir Jafar held his forces back. The Nawab's army, suddenly fighting without a third of its strength, collapsed. The battle lasted a few hours. The Nawab fled and was later murdered. Clive installed Mir Jafar as the new Nawab, a puppet, a placeholder, a man who owed his position entirely to the company and whose territory's tax revenues now flowed through a series of carefully constructed legal arrangements directly into company accounts. Bengal, the richest province of the richest empire on earth, had been acquired not through military genius, but through corruption, through bribery, through the systematic purchase of loyalty that should never have been for sale. And it was just the beginning. Province by province, decade by decade, the company expanded, sometimes through war, more often through the same method that had worked so perfectly at Plassey, finding the fracture lines inside Mughal political structures, the rivalries, the succession disputes, the resentments of underpaid soldiers and overtaxed merchants, and inserting money into those fractures until they widened into cracks, and the cracks became collapses. The Mughal emperors in Delhi watched it happen and could do almost nothing. By the early 19th century, the emperor controlled barely the city of Delhi itself. The man who carried the title of Mughal emperor, heir to Babur and Akbar and Shah Jahan, successor to the rulers of the richest empire in human history, was receiving a pension from a trading company. And then came 1857, the Indian Rebellion, the last desperate, magnificent, ultimately doomed attempt to push the British out and restore something of what had been lost. Soldiers, farmers, princes, and ordinary people across northern India rose simultaneously against company rule in an uprising so widespread and so ferocious that it genuinely threatened British control of the subcontinent for the first and only time. At the center of it, almost despite himself, stood the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, an old man in his 80s, a poet of extraordinary delicacy and emotional depth, a man who had spent his entire reign as a ceremonial figurehead with no real power, writing verses about love and loss and the passage of time in a court that had become a shadow of what it once was. The rebels came to him and asked him to lead them, to be their symbol, their legitimacy, their connection to the empire that had once made the world tremble. He agreed, and in doing so, signed his own final sentence. The British crushed the rebellion with a brutality that shocked even contemporary British observers. Delhi was retaken, the Mughal princes were executed, and Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last emperor, the poet king, was put on trial, convicted of treason against a trading company that had stolen his empire, and exiled to Rangoon in Burma, where he died in 1862, in a small house, far from everything he had ever known. He wrote his own epitaph in verse, a couplet so heartbreaking in its simplicity that it has never been forgotten. He said he had not even been granted enough land in his beloved homeland to be buried in. The richest empire in human history ended not with a battle, not with a treaty, but with an old poet dying alone in exile, writing verses that no one in power was reading anymore. Close your eyes and think about the Indian subcontinent today. 3 nuclear powers, 1,400,000,000 people in India alone, 220 million in Pakistan, 170 million in Bangladesh. 3 separate nations with 3 separate governments, 3 separate foreign policies, and 3 separate national identities, spending enormous amounts of energy defining themselves against each other. All of them, every single one, living inside a world that the Mughal Empire built. The borders that divide them are the borders that emerged from Mughal collapse and British manipulation of that collapse. The languages they speak carry Mughal fingerprints. Urdu, the language of Pakistani literature, of Bollywood romance, of Qawwali poetry that makes grown adults weep in shrines across the subcontinent, was born in the cosmopolitan mixing of the Mughal court. Hindi itself absorbed so many Persian and Arabic words through Mughal cultural dominance that the 2 languages share more vocabulary than their political separation suggests. The food, the architecture, the music, the miniature painting tradition, the formal garden design that appears in public parks from Lahore to Delhi to Dhaka, the wedding traditions that families spend years saving for, the poetry of loss and longing that runs like an underground river beneath the surface of subcontinental culture in every language and every religion and every community. All of it, every single thread, traces back to the empire that a homeless prince built from nothing on a battlefield outside Panipat in 1526. The Mughals are gone. Their emperors are dust. Their treasury was looted by a trading company. Their last emperor died in exile, writing poetry that nobody in power bothered to read. But every time you hear Urdu poetry that breaks your heart, every time you taste a biryani and cannot explain why it moves you, every time you stand before the Taj Mahal at sunrise and feel something shift inside your chest that you cannot name or locate or explain, the empire is still alive, still breathing, still refusing to end.